The engines of the fighter roared in the cockpit, an almost visceral vibration that coursed through Captain Jason Wilde's body. His gloved hands tightened on the controls, knuckles white, as the sharp hum of his craft sliced through the heavy atmosphere. Ahead, the target zone loomed, a blackened war zone where the Tyrax forces were rapidly encroaching on the last human stronghold in the region. The ground was littered with shattered remnants of resistance, smoke and fire billowing up from the earth like the breath of a dying beast. "This is it, Wilde. Time to make a mark," Mara West's voice crackled through his comms, sharp and steady despite the chaos. He could almost hear the smirk in her words, her way of masking the nervous tension that clung to them both. Jason's jaw clenched. He had been in countless dogfights before, but this felt different. This mission wasn't about glory or strategy, it was about survival. Not just for him, but for every last soul on the ground. "Don't jinx us, West. We're not even in position yet," Jason replied, trying to shake off the feeling gnawing at him. They had been through this countless times before, scrambling into hostile airspace, a quick drop and dive, surgical strikes. But the Tyrax were unlike any enemy they had faced before, a ruthless, technologically superior force that made no room for mistakes. "Looks like they're already making their move," Mara said, pulling the fighter into a sharp dive. The sleek craft banked hard, the landscape below coming into sharp focus. The Tyrax, monstrous and towering, were advancing across the ravaged battlefield, their massive war machines dwarfing the infantry scrambling below. Human soldiers fought desperately to hold the line around a communications tower, the key to rallying reinforcements. "Hold your fire," Jason said, voice steady despite the rising tension in his chest. "We need to take out the artillery first." Mara didn't respond with words. Instead, her nimble fingers danced across the control panel, bringing up targeting systems. Jason watched the radar screen flicker to life, identifying enemy positions with eerie precision. His pulse quickened. Conflict introduced, the ground forces were pinned down. A single direct hit to the tower's generator would cripple their communications, making any reinforcement efforts impossible. It was the perfect storm, a race against time with the Tyrax closing in faster than anyone could predict. Jason and Mara's mission was simple: clear the artillery positions and give the infantry a chance. But the enemy wasn't making it easy. Target locked, Mara's voice was tight with focus. Jason felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, this was their moment. But just as he was about to confirm the strike, his heart dropped. The Tyrax commander appeared on the horizon, a hulking figure rising above the chaos, directing the attack. He was standing exposed on the ridge. "Forget the artillery," Jason muttered under his breath. "That's our target." Mara hesitated. "Are you sure? We need to clear those guns before." "We don't have time," Jason cut her off, his voice taking on a steely edge. "If we take out the commander, we take down the whole operation." Character development, Mara's gaze flickered toward the targeting system, then back to Jason. She could see it in his eyes, he was already committed, and once Jason Wilde set his mind to something, nothing short of an apocalypse could turn him away. He was a man of action, and his reputation on the battlefield was built on an unshakable belief in doing what had to be done. But Mara knew, better than anyone, that his courage often danced dangerously close to recklessness. They had lost good people because of his choices before. "Fine," Mara said with a deep breath. "You lead. I'll follow." The words were spoken with reluctant acceptance, but her tone was still resolute. Jason nodded, his jaw set. "Stay close. We're going in hot." Pacing in rising tension, the fighter dropped into a steep dive toward the Tyrax lines, the noise of the engines deafening as they descended into enemy territory. Jason's focus sharpened, every instinct screaming to act, but he fought the urge to fire prematurely. The Tyrax commander had to be in his sights, one clean shot, and the battle could change. The ground forces below erupted in chaos as enemy fire pierced the sky. Explosions rocked the earth, throwing plumes of dirt and debris into the air. The Tyrax were relentless. Their ground troops moved like a swarm, coordinated and methodical, while the towering war machines loomed behind them, each a nightmare of metal and alien technology. Jason's fingers itched. They were close now. Character depth and internal conflict. As he neared the target, his mind flickered back to past battles, missions gone wrong, innocent lives lost under his command. The memory of a failed operation in the north was always just beneath the surface, a constant weight on his shoulders. But in the cockpit, with the hum of his fighter beneath him and Mara's steady presence beside him, he pushed those thoughts away. There was no room for doubt here. There was no time for hesitation. "Ready, Wilde," Mara's voice cut through his thoughts. "Now," he breathed, pulling the trigger. A burst of laser fire shot from the fighter's nose, streaking through the air with precision. Jason held his breath. The shot struck true. Cliffhanger, the Tyrax commander staggered, smoke pouring from his armored chest as the impact sent him reeling. For a moment, Jason thought he'd won. But then, the commander steadied himself, a wicked grin spreading beneath his helmet. He wasn't dead. Not yet. "We've got company," Mara warned. A shadow loomed overhead. Another Tyrax ship, bigger, faster, tore through the sky, bearing down on them with deadly intent. Jason's pulse raced as the stakes escalated. The mission was far from over. The sudden roar of the Tyrax ship overhead sent a shockwave through the air. Jason's fighter banked sharply, narrowly avoiding a pulse blast that ripped through the empty space where he had been just a fraction of a second ago. The heat of it singed his external sensors, and his craft rattled from the near miss. "Talk to me, Mara," Jason shouted over the comms, his pulse racing as he twisted the controls, forcing the fighter into a vertical climb. Mara's voice cut through the static, calm but edged with tension. "We've got company, Wilde. Fast, too. They've got a gunship on our tail." Jason gritted his teeth. The Tyrax ship was a sleek, terrifying mass of armored plating, angular and designed for speed, something no human fighter could match in raw power. It was closing in, and Jason's heart thudded louder in his chest. This wasn't just a battle for control, it was a fight to survive. Conflict deepens. Jason felt the hum of his fighter as he pushed it to its limits, the craft protesting under the strain. Below them, the battlefield was a hellscape of fire and smoke. On the ground, human forces scrambled to fortify their positions. If they failed here, this whole region would fall to the Tyrax, an alien race that had already wiped out countless colonies. The stakes were higher than they'd ever been. "We can't outrun it, Wilde. The gunship's locking onto us," Mara warned, her hands moving like lightning across the controls, trying to outmaneuver their pursuer. "Hold on," Jason muttered, gritting his teeth. He had to think. Think. It had been a long time since he'd felt this outgunned. The dogfights were supposed to be his strength, but nothing in his training had prepared him for the relentless aggression of the Tyrax. He could feel Mara's eyes on him, waiting, trusting him to make the call. Jason's mind raced. They had to turn the tables, fast. "West, set a course for the canyon. I'll draw him in." Mara hesitated, but she was quick to comply, the ship diving steeply as the canyon loomed ahead like a chasm of jagged rocks. Character growth and development. Jason's fingers flew over the control panel, twisting the ship in tight maneuvers as the Tyrax gunship followed them, relentless. His body, conditioned by years of combat, moved in sync with the ship, every instinct honed to perfection. But beneath the controlled exterior, the old fear stirred. His last engagement had left him scarred, a constant reminder of the mistakes he could never undo. But there was no room for self-doubt now. He needed to push through it. His squadron was counting on him, and Mara, his most trusted companion, was right there with him. "You're thinking too much, Wilde," Mara teased, her voice light, though there was an edge to it. "Just do what you do best." "Right," Jason muttered, offering her a tight grin. The canyon was closing in on them, narrow and treacherous. But there was no turning back now. If he could outmaneuver the Tyrax gunship here, they'd have a shot at survival. They had to get to the rocks, use them as cover, one shot, One shot to break the lock and then it was all about getting back in the fight. Rising tension and strategy. Jason pushed the fighter into a hair-raising dive, the canyon walls speeding past in a blur. The sound of enemy fire pinging off the hull was deafening, but Jason's focus was laser-sharp. The Tyrax ship was right behind them, close enough for Jason to feel the heat from its plasma cannons. His finger hovered over the trigger, waiting. Waiting for the perfect moment. Just a little closer, Jason muttered, eyes narrowing as he locked onto the canyon's narrowest turn ahead. He could hear the engine's low hum, felt the acceleration pulling him forward. "West, now," he shouted. Mara's hand flew over the controls, flipping a switch that released a burst of countermeasures. Flares shot out like fireworks, creating a distraction. For one brief moment, the Tyrax gunship hesitated, its targeting system flaring up as it processed the new data. Jason slammed the fighter's throttle forward, breaking into a sharp, upward roll. The Tyrax ship, caught by the sudden change in direction, was slow to adjust. Just like that, Jason had his opening. He squeezed the trigger. A burst of green plasma shot out from the fighter's nose, slamming into the gunship's side with a sickening crack. The Tyrax ship veered off, smoke trailing behind it. But it didn't go down, not yet. The massive alien craft began to barrel roll, fighting to regain control. Jason's heart raced. He had the advantage. For now. Character tension and internal conflict. But as he glanced over at Mara, her face grim, Jason knew it wasn't over. The Tyrax forces were like a tide, relentless and unforgiving. One victory wouldn't win the war. And despite the adrenaline flooding his system, Jason couldn't help but feel the weight of his past decisions bearing down on him. Every victory, every close call, it all piled up. One wrong move, and it would all be for nothing. "I've got eyes on their infantry," Mara said, pulling his focus back to the battle. "We've got incoming ground troops, 5 clicks from the tower. If we don't clear them out, the tower's done." Jason didn't answer immediately, his eyes scanning the battlefield below. The communication tower was their last line of defense. If they lost it, there would be no way to regroup. He wasn't about to let that happen. "Take us in," he said quietly. "We end this now." Cliffhanger. Before Mara could respond, the sound of an explosion rattled the cockpit, far too close for comfort. The ship shook violently, sending Jason's stomach lurching. He could see the flash of enemy artillery in the distance. They were already setting up for their next strike. Jason's voice turned low and steady, with a cold certainty. "Time to finish what we started." As he readied his fighter for the next dive, the looming dread that had been buried in his mind resurfaced. The battle was only beginning. Jason's grip tightened on the fighter's controls, his knuckles turning white. The chaos around him was suffocating, an unrelenting storm of explosions and gunfire that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the battlefield. But his focus remained unshaken, locked on the communication tower below. One more strike, one final push, and they could cripple the Tyrax forces. But the cost would be high. The air around him felt thick, oppressive, as the fighter skimmed just above the jagged canyon cliffs, forcing the craft into tight, perilous turns. A low growl came from the engines as the ship fought to stay steady. Beside him, Mara's face was a mask of concentration, her hands flying over the controls with practiced precision. She was the calm in the storm, her confidence infectious. But even she couldn't hide the faint trace of worry in her eyes. "You're not going to pull this off, Wilde," she said, her voice steady but laced with tension. "I have to," he replied, not taking his eyes off the radar screen. The Tyrax gunship had barely managed to recover from the previous strike, but it wasn't finished yet. Jason had seen their resilience firsthand, and it terrified him. Every mission so far had been a narrow escape, a precarious dance between life and death. This one felt different, darker. The Tyrax had learned from their mistakes, adapted to every move. Mara's gaze flicked over to him, concern flashing across her face. "If you're going in again, I'm coming with you," she said, determination hardening her tone. Jason shot her a look, barely acknowledging her words, but the truth was clear, they were in this together. There was no other choice. She had been his wingman for years, her loyalty unwavering, but even that wouldn't be enough if they miscalculated. The growing threat. The enemy artillery was closing in, shells landing dangerously close to the human stronghold. The tower was nearly down, and once it was, the Tyrax would seize control of the region. Jason's heart raced as he scanned the battlefield, his mind running through options. Every decision felt like the wrong one. They were outmatched in every way, technologically, numerically, and in firepower. Their only advantage was speed. "Focus, Wilde," Mara barked, her voice snapping him back into the moment. "We need a plan, not a prayer." She was right. Time was running out. The Tyrax were overwhelming the last human defenses on the ground, pushing forward with mechanical precision, their massive war machines plowing through the opposition. They had to hit the artillery hard, take out the command center, and do it before the tower crumbled entirely. Jason's hand moved instinctively toward the weapons console, selecting the EMP strike, a last-ditch weapon designed to cripple enemy electronics. It was risky, and he'd only used it once before, on a mission that ended in disaster. But there was no room for hesitation now. Mara's voice came over the comms again, sharper this time. "Wilde, if this doesn't work..." "It has to work," Jason cut her off, his jaw clenched. "We're out of options." Character development. Mara stayed silent for a moment, the air between them thick with unsaid words. Jason had always led from the front, charging into danger without looking back. She had followed him because she trusted him, even when his decisions didn't make sense. But this mission, it had shaken them both. The stakes felt higher now, the pressure unbearable. And in the quiet moments, she couldn't help but wonder, how long could this go on before they cracked under the weight of their choices? She glanced at him, eyes narrowing. "You're not invincible, Wilde." "I know," he said quietly, his voice almost too soft to hear over the roar of the engines. "But I'm all we've got." Mara's fingers tightened on the controls, her expression unreadable. She didn't respond, but she didn't have to. They both knew the cost of failure. Pacing and rising tension. The canyon walls began to narrow ahead, and Jason steered the fighter into a deadly dive, narrowly avoiding an incoming Tyrax plasma bolt that left a trail of scorch marks in the sky. The gunship had regrouped, its ominous shadow looming on their tail once again. "Here we go," Jason muttered. The target loomed large below them, the Tyrax artillery installation. They had to destroy it, or the ground forces would be overwhelmed in minutes. "Do it," Mara said through clenched teeth. "You've got one shot." Jason nodded, heart thudding in his chest. He hit the release button. The EMP detonated in a burst of electromagnetic force, momentarily blinding their instruments. For a brief second, Jason felt the ship lurch, as if the entire world around him had shifted on its axis. The Tyrax artillery stopped firing, its systems frozen, vulnerable. But the victory was short-lived. The Tyrax gunship was still on them, its weapons powered up and ready to fire. Conflict climax. Jason's pulse surged. There was no time to think. He pulled the fighter into a sharp climb, desperate to escape the Tyrax ship's line of fire. The world outside blurred as the engines screamed beneath them. "Mara! We need to lose it, now!" Jason barked, his voice tight with urgency. "I'm trying." Mara's voice cracked through the strain, her fingers moving faster than Jason thought possible. "But it's too fast. We can't outrun it." Jason's mind raced. They needed a new strategy. And fast. Suddenly, a thought struck him, a brutal, dangerous plan that had only one chance of working. He glanced at Mara, the weight of it all settling into his chest. "Mara, get ready to drop me on the surface." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "You're insane." "Do it." Jason's voice left no room for argument. With a deep breath, Mara punched a series of buttons, and the fighter lurched again as Jason braced himself for what was coming. The final gamble had begun. Cliffhanger. The Tyrax gunship fired. The explosion rang out like thunder. The fighter dropped sharply toward the battlefield. Jason didn't know what would happen next. But this was the moment of truth. The ground rushed up at Jason with terrifying speed, the rumble of the engines still screaming in his ears as the fighter plummeted toward the battlefield below. Every nerve in his body was on fire, adrenaline coursing through his veins like a powerful drug. His eyes were locked on the Tyrax gunship trailing them, its shadow looming larger with each passing second. For a moment, time seemed to stretch and bend. The world outside was a blur, chaos, destruction, and the looming uncertainty of whether they'd survive this final gambit. Jason's mind was a whirlwind. The fighter had shed its momentum, hurtling downward like a stone, and with every second that passed, the ground grew closer. The thought of crashing into it never felt more imminent, yet his mind remained focused. "Mara, hold steady," he shouted, though his voice was barely audible over the thundering sound of wind and weapons fire. He trusted her, knew she'd do everything in her power to keep them alive. "Steady? You want me to keep this thing from splattering on the ground like a bug on a windshield?" Mara's voice crackled through the comm, edged with panic. "Wilde, you're out of your damn mind." Jason didn't have time to reassure her. The Tyrax gunship was firing again, its weapons a dazzling blur of deadly lights. A missile whizzed by, narrowly missing the fighter as it dove toward the ground, and Jason's heart skipped a beat. But there was no turning back now. They had one shot, one last move to win the war. The EMP blast had only stalled the Tyrax artillery for a moment. To truly stop them, they had to neutralize the command center, and Jason knew exactly where that was. The massive tower in the heart of the battlefield. Mara's hands were a blur, her fingers dancing across the controls with precision, but Jason knew it wasn't just her flying that was keeping them intact. It was the bond they shared, the silent understanding that they were in this together, and neither one of them would let go, not now. He glanced at the radar, calculating the exact moment they would break through the Tyrax gunship's fire and drop onto the battlefield. The time was now. "Drop me," he said, his voice calm, even though his pulse was thundering in his ears. "Do it now." Mara hesitated for a split second. Her eyes flicked to him, wide with disbelief, but then her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't need to ask why. She knew what had to be done. With a final press of a button, the ship jolted. The emergency hatch opened beneath Jason's feet, and he was launched into the air, his body free-falling for a heart-stopping moment. The world tilted around him, and he fought the instinct to flail, to scream. He had no time for fear. His mission was all that mattered. The Tyrax gunship above them roared, its weapons charging, but Jason was already moving. He fell through the air, the wind whistling past him as his heart pounded. Below, the Tyrax forces were still regrouping, still unprepared for what was coming. He activated the wristband communicator, speaking into it with a steady voice. "Strike now. Give them hell. Climax and resolution." The ground rushed toward him with brutal certainty. Jason's mind raced as he hit the ground, rolling and using every ounce of military training to absorb the impact. He hit the dirt hard, but his body had been through worse. He sprang to his feet in an instant, the air thick with smoke and the smell of burning metal. His rifle was in his hand before he even had time to think, and he bolted toward the command center. He barely noticed the chaos around him, the firefights between human soldiers and Tyrax infantry, the deep rumble of explosions shaking the ground beneath him. His focus was sharp. The command center was ahead. One more push, and they would win. As he sprinted, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the sound of the Tyrax gunship's engines faded into the distance. The fighters in the sky had done their job. The path was clear for Jason and the ground forces to make their final stand. Character growth. Jason's mind was clear now, no longer burdened by doubt. In that moment, as he sprinted toward the tower, everything became simple. It wasn't about winning a battle or taking down an enemy, it was about protecting humanity, the people he'd sworn to defend, and ensuring that the future didn't belong to the Tyrax. He could feel the weight of his choice, the cost of everything they had sacrificed, But he had come to realize something in these final moments: heroism wasn't about fearlessness. It was about fighting despite it. Mara's voice crackled through the calm once more, her tone filled with relief. "Wilde, you did it. The tower's down. We've got them." Resolution and themes. Jason stopped in his tracks, his chest heaving with the strain of exertion. The Tyrax command center, now a smoldering ruin, had fallen. The tide had turned. The battlefield was still, save for the distant rumble of retreating Tyrax forces. Jason exhaled, a long, drawn-out breath. He lowered his rifle, the adrenaline slowly starting to fade. He didn't know if this was victory, or if the war was truly over. But in this moment, humanity had won. Against all odds, they had fought back. Mara's voice came through again, her tone softer now, tinged with emotion. "Jason, you're alive." "Barely," he replied, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "But I'll take it." The fight wasn't over, but today, they had pushed the Tyrax back. Humanity had held the line, and for now, that was enough. Jason looked up at the sky, watching as the remnants of the Tyrax fleet retreated into the dark void of space. They had won today. And in the end, that was all that mattered.